Oops. As I prepare to introduce Kivi, he asked, do people actually ask questions? That'll be after the lecture. So you are invited to ask questions, to engage in a conversation. I am very excited. It's also very personal to welcome Kivi. Kivi Sotama from Helsinki. He runs a practice together with his sister. They do architectural projects, but they also do projects that has included an output of objects, environments, and I got to know Kivi, it has to be personal, I got to know Kivi in 1996, and it was very soon after I finished studying at the AA, and Michael Hensel and Tommy Rebus had been in Helsinki to do a workshop, and so to say, they brought Kivi back from Helsinki to London, and we were together for an exhibition that was staged at the AA, and this was the beginning of the Ocean Network, and very soon we ended up collaborating on a series of projects. The first ones were in 1997. It included a series of competitions, and this collaboration went on till 2000 when I decided to leave. And it included small forms of success. One expression of that success was, I suppose, when we recently met again after many years in Montreal, where Greg Lynn hosted the Archaeology of the Digital. It was a series of events where, for the Canadian Centre of Architecture, he had invited people to different events. The centre was collecting the work, and the work that Kivi and I, with other colleagues, had done at that time, back in the mid to late 1990s, was part of it. And we were, funnily enough, then part of this quasi-television talk show that Greg Lynn staged at Canadian Centre of Architecture. Yeah, and it was of course, certainly for me, a great little reunion after all those years. All those years included that Kivi, having been educated in Helsinki, but then also being at the Royal College of Art, ended up going to America to teach at Columbus, Ohio, where also Jeffrey Kipnis is. He left that university to go to UCLA and was engaged teaching at UCLA for no less than 8 years, and very much became integrated in certainly that West Coast American scene. But my relationship to you harks then back to those days in the 1990s. It was hilarious. It was like an ongoing party, and we would do, well, quite frankly, our work would proceed, our working days would proceed like this. We would open the day with a bottle of whiskey in the morning for breakfast, and we would work through to lunch and manage to take that somewhere. Then we would go on working on the competition until it was time for a nightclub, and then there was probably a few hours of sleep, and this is how the days would go on. And it was just an enormous amount of fun. I think if we would disagree about that history to some degree, I sort of recollect that we knew very little about what we were doing. We were just trying to do something. You, Kivi, when we discussed it with Greg, you actually had a recollection of our having a certain direction and engagement. Regardless, it doesn't really matter. What matters certainly seems to me in recollecting it that it was an enormous amount of fun, and it was an energy in it that also in so many ways has lasted, certainly for me, but I also think for you till this day. That wouldn't be the only feed into your work, I'm sure, because I would imagine that the years in America has been very formative, and you have gone on to have some very beautiful projects also in Helsinki, where a recent representation of Finland for a large, that was a Triennale in the World Expo. A beautiful project that in some ways even reminds me a little bit of the project that that you brought to London back then in 1996, which was called Extra Terrain. And it would be a mouthful to say that, you know, that what we did at that time would be anticipating certain other things, but I do think that the way that you went about, for instance, with your colleague Marcus Homsten at that time, to sample basically parts from airplanes, and basically not quite a question of kit bashing, but actually assembling these into producing something very, very different. Certainly is reminiscent of things that also are current today and that we still try to figure out how to go about. Kivi, I'm delighted to welcome you and look greatly forward to your lecture.
All right, thank you, Johan. It is really a rare pleasure to be here, and we could easily, I think, tell you war stories all night long. I do wonder sometimes when I look at the work honestly, whether there's any growing up that's happened or whether I ever had a new idea since those days. There's, you know, that time of your life you are, I don't know if we knew what we were doing, but there's certainly this, you know, mad desire that I hope you have to accomplish something and break rules and break ground and challenge everybody. And if anything, I suppose I've tried to retain a little bit of that attitude, and it's also made my life a little bit difficult in the world of design and architecture, because I think most people in most schools are taught to get rid of all the friction between you and the design. Like, good design is something that doesn't cause friction, it just works, and it's background, and especially in the Nordic countries. And I was always somebody who was in for the friction. I mean, that piece of furniture, the extra terrain, it was meant, I couldn't build a building, so I built the furniture, and I wanted to look like it's going to kill you. You have to adjust to it, you cannot recognize it, you have to play with it to figure out what it is, so you try to challenge aesthetic conventions, functional conventions, find new design procedures, use new materials to realize those things, and so on. Now I realize I should have a slide of that thing, but just imagine something extraterrestrial and black and kind of stealth bombery. But I'm still doing that, all of that. So as Johan mentioned, I work with my sister. She's trained really as a ceramic and glass artist, and then did some industrial design. I think you can see some of that in our work. Then maybe the last thing I'll say about the kind of this history part, when Johan was talking, it reminded me of Wolf Prix, who said that he believes that there's three parts to an architect's career. It's pioneering, settling, and professionalism. And to some degree, I can fit myself into that model. So pioneering was with Johan in the 90s. Settling was the 2000s in American academia, the West Coast scene mostly. And then now it's been since more or less 2010 an attempt at professionalism. So working with real clients, with real problems. And I actually explicitly made a point. I was looking at my portfolio and I just said, we've done enough competitions, installations, we've done it. I've got it out of my systems. Now we're just gonna do things that get manufactured, built, realized. Humbly, doesn't matter, but that's the criteria. And then we have to try to run the practice on that as well. So, but that's the backstory. Today I thought I'd talk about, I'll give a little introduction to the studio as it's now, but the studio really, there's a different name, but it's an evolution of all those things that we already did in the 90s. I'll talk a little bit about the studio and what I'm most concerned with, which is sensation, and how the idea of sensation relates to the idea of architecture and design as a cultural act. So I'll talk about a little bit about how to use sensation in order to change the social space you occupy, and how to do that in a kind of creative, critical manner that can contribute to contemporary culture. So I'm somebody who thinks that that's what you have to do with work, which gets me into trouble sometimes. Then I'll talk a little bit about digitalization. I just realized that together with Johan, we're now part of history as the first generation of digital practices at the CCA. But I engaged the digital initially because I desired to do something and I needed new tools to do that. And I embraced the computer and then laid, new materials, especially through Johan, and new digital manufacturing techniques, etc. And I've kept at it. So I'll talk a little bit about the digital at the moment. And then I go back to some of our work and I'll show a little bit more building scale work and how it relates to these issues of digital and sensation. And then I'll show a little bit what I call like ecosystems of objects that form environments for projects, and talk about how digital and sensation works in those terms. And in the end, I'll show a couple of projects that relate to another ambition, which is cooking and food, and I've been very happy to have this wonderful chefs as clients, so I'll show you a couple of restaurants and then that's the end of it. And I think in the last restaurant, many of these issues in some way come together. So when we have to explain people what we do, we usually say that we do everything, and because of our history, we turned out that the specialty in the office is the fact that we have no specialty. And these days our commercial clients are ones who want experience, that for some reason you're going to compete with experience. So for example, the hospitality sector is one place where you compete with experience. And if experience is at stake, then everything matters. You cannot ignore a part, because then the experience breaks. And it turns out that our ability to work from like building scale to the scale of objects came in very handy. But when we were starting out, I never realized that it was a realization that I had later on as clients approached us. So the first part, sensation. I'll show one installation only. This was built for the 21st Century Museum of Contemporary Art in Kanazawa. It was the opening exhibition of Sejima's show. We were commissioned to do a pavilion, and we were right next to Ernesto Neto, whose work I love, and next to Issei Miyake, whose work I love, and I think you can see the influence of both in this piece. But in short, this was a piece which was really a study about the creation of a particular kind of experience. Sejima's architecture is this minimal, pristine, translucent, and I thought that I would create something that's in extreme contrast to that architecture, like an exotic butterfly that's caught in the constraints of this aquarium. And it was simply built using pleated fabrics and aluminum pipe, and it came with sound and light, which I don't have here, but that were programmed to create a kind of one particular sensation mood on the outside, and once you fought your way through these red butterfly wings in the middle, there was this little paradise Zen garden that you could sit in, and the sound would change. So we did a lot of this type of work in the early days in the 90s, installations and so on, that where we, I think, honed our skill to understand the effects that our architectural designs had on people. And I remember we spoke at CCA about some of the projects that were in the collections, and I made the point that we actually always built those projects. And what I meant is that we would have a speculation, a large competition proposal or something, and then we'd build an installation which is based on the essential tectonic techniques of rendering that space, and we would thus create an understanding of how that works, and we would also create the techniques that were required for producing that work. So this was the Helsinki Guggenheim. It's the only unbuilt work here, I think. No, there's a couple. It was a recent competition. That's the world's all-time largest architecture competitions. And proud of it because we're the only Finnish office who was awarded in this competition. There were 1,785 entries or something ballpark like that. But the reason I have it here is that it has an uncanny relationship to that red butterfly that you just saw, a Spanish dancer. And the name came from the Spanish flamenco dancer, how they sort of move with this centrifugal motion and produce, like let their dress fly to produce a space around them. So here the idea was to produce a new type of courtyard building. So that you see the Helsinki city fabric on the left, you see this on the port on the right. And the idea was to build a building that creates a new kind of urban and public space. That's a building that's aesthetically new, maybe more affiliated to the world of boats and liquids than the city, but which I thought is appropriate as it next to the water and next to the boats. And its form actually emerges from a diagram of flows. It's a diagram of flows of traffic, maintenance traffic, pedestrian, bikes, etc. And all of these wrap around or move through these envelopes and give them their form. And the reason I have this here is that in all of these projects, when there's a real cultural context, I've always been, I retrospectively realized this, but I've always been first and foremost interested in the production of a particular social space or political space, if you will. So in other words, when I start a project, I would always think, well, what do I do now in order to intervene in culture through my project towards some end? So I would always have this conversation. I think we had those conversations already back then. I would always think, well, what is it that Helsinki needs? So this was called Kissing Helsinki. The idea was to undermine the kind of institutional outsidedness of Guggenheim by weaving the institution into the city fabric. The idea was to produce a building which is not a building but actually a means of producing an urban space. Something that networks the flows and works with the flows in the city, etc. Something that aesthetically suggests a new, more dynamic way of being in the world and being in the city, in a port city, as opposed to the kind of more Cartesian architecture on the left side. But like all of the motivations behind this work is, all the moves are coordinated towards the production of that particular effect or social space, if you will. I don't know if you use that term, if you're familiar with that term. But in other words, I'm trying to use, if with a Spanish dancer there's the color and the form and the sensibility and the aesthetics and the affiliations that the aesthetics bring and the way that you move through this structure, all of those we're trying to coordinate in order to produce a particular sensation, a particular experience. And more often than not, that experience is not one that's necessarily easy and it's not one that the client is asking for, but it's something that we consider we believe in that particular cultural context. So a really concrete example at small scale is this. This is a prototype house built in a place near Lake Vitresk where Elio Saarinen's famous houses are. It's a small house which is digitally designed and digitally manufactured. And I'll talk about the digital afterward, later on. But here the idea was to look at the convention of a house. What is it? It's an object, it's a symbol, it closes everybody out. So we designed a house. It's inexpensive, made out of inexpensive materials, and the entire idea is that it's open to the world around it. On one side, it's closed towards the street, towards the forest, towards the inside of an island, and then the other side, it's radically open. And it's not an issue of just putting glass on a building, it's an issue of treating one facade and its geometry and its materials so that it appears to miss that facade. And that's not to look cool or for a styling reason, it's an honest attempt to produce this social space in front of a house and radically change the way a domestic situation would work. And all of these propositions come with risk. And the moment I say that this is my intent, you're always able to be critical. Then you can be critical. You can say, well, I don't think it does what you say it does. But I don't claim that the project I think Herbert Musham said beautifully, writing about Richard Meyer's work, that architects' thoughts and philosophies and theories regarding their projects are part of design process, but in no way define the end result. So I'm keenly aware and always been aware of the fact that the performance of the project, of our projects, is beyond our control, outside of our control, and to a large degree unpredictable, and it depends on who engages the work. Nevertheless, I believe that it's possible to develop increasing skill at controlling the effects of your design. For example, through aesthetics, through organization, through form and the affiliations that it builds. You can change the way people feel. And I think really I'm interested on that level, developing more and more control over the work. I would always make this joke, being a little bit critical of some of my contemporaries who engaged in digital speculative work, whose work was so driven by the research that whatever they did would look more or less the same. And I always thought that even a hard rock band knows how to play a love song. And it seems to me weird that if you're designing, that you wouldn't be able to play a love song sometimes, and sometimes play something that's more hardcore and provocative when it's appropriate. So I'm fascinated by these things like the sommelier, when they talk about wine and the kind of terminology they use to describe the flavor of the wine, the scent of the wine, because they exercise then control over these issues. So we try to practice this, for example, over form, that degree of specificity. With my sister's dog, a Labradoodle, and there are a lot of dogs in the office. Like sometimes we have 5 dogs in the office, which is a bit crazy. I have 3, and she has 2, and sometimes they're there all at the same time. So which, like, we have 1/3 more staff suddenly. And with these projects, and like the other project that you see, we design everything for it. Every piece of furniture, all the lights, shelving systems, everything is designed by us. I don't know whether it's a vestige of the Alvar Aalto and the idea of the Gesamtkunstwerk, but that's what we're doing. But I have to say that there's a longer discussion to have about this, but and I'm sure Johan would remember this, I'm always been somebody who's been really uncomfortable with the kind of architecture that comes with instructions for use, and in that sense is over-determined. I hate that. At the same time, I want to design everything. I want to design the door handle, the chair, everything. But we're trying to figure out how to do it in such a way that we produce these open-ended environments that are highly specific, full of possibility, and have some sort of escape velocity when you engage them, and then they take a life of their own. Oh, there's Haru. You see Johan? Here you go. One thing that I got from Johan was love of big dogs. He had Rhodesian Ridgebacks, and I had Rhodesian Ridgebacks. Then I moved on to a Weimaraner, and now I have Deutsche Kurzhaar too. So I got to move a little faster. Now a couple of words about the digital as it relates to the work. So this is a kind of crash course through what's happening in the digital in a very general blue sky way. But the last revolution that happened in material world was the Industrial Revolution. We learned how to copy things, and of course in architecture, which is made of component, it manifests itself in a certain way. What's happening is that we suddenly have this world of the digital where instead of copies, you can make iterations, variations, you can make the series of one, you can inexpensively make very limited, very articulated things, unlike in the industrial age where you had to find beauty in the aesthetics of simple forms, because that's what the industrial manufacturing was happy with. If you work with 3D printing, for example, I'm sure you know, complexity comes for free, only material costs. You used to always have to work for a certain manufacturing technique, but what's happening now is more or less manufacturing does anything you want. And now that if everything's possible, there's much more demand or pressure on having good ideas. Now, like I said, this is, anybody who does anything real realizes that these are simplifications. And it's not like industrial manufacturing is going anywhere, but you're going to have this new layer of digital manufacturing, and you'll see in later projects how we use both of these together quite fluidly. But this is all to paint a kind of clear picture of where we're going. And of course, if you design for robots, you have to learn how to think in new ways. You have to learn how to think algorithmically, use software, use the kind of software that has increasing intelligence embedded in it, using analyses to drive, for example, the building skin. But that building skin would be the world's most expensive building skin unless you had digital manufacturing, such as incremental sheet forming, which, when it's a robot, it doesn't care if each sheet is different or they're the same. So when you marry these things, you can start getting something magic. And of course, if you do work with material scientists, you will discover to your surprise that they design materials. These days, it's not a question of, here's a material. They'll ask you, what would you like the material to be? What would you like it to do? In Finland, for example, nanocellulose is something that's it's heavily developed. And you can do nanocellulose that's conductive, that's thin and strong like fiber web, that's aerogel, 98% air, incredibly light. From that single material, you can use nanoscopic processes in order to structure it to form different kinds of materials. And finally, all things electronic, these microphones, phones, computers, little by little migrate and become more and more a part of our material environment. So I believe that in order to capitalize on the digital, you cannot be just good with software and do stuff on a computer and then go to a conventional factory. Or you cannot be somebody who's working with digital manufacturing and cannot use software. Or you can't do both of those if you don't understand what materials they are and how, for example, nanocellulose might work with 3D printing, or how it's used on paper machines to produce new kinds of fabrics. And none of this, if you have a great idea that capitalizes on the digital design, manufacturing, new materials, you might then, what you will inevitably discover is that you'll need a new business model. So you need business people who are going to help you. And you're going to realize that you run into legal problems because you cannot do intellectual property rights on things where every piece in the series is different. There's no way to copyright that. So in other words, in order to capitalize on the digital paradigm shift, you need to deal with all of this, which means you need to talk to people from the different disciplines. So the first thing when I went back from the States, in addition to running our studio, we started a place called AD, which is a platform that brings the best engineers, business people, lawyers, designers together, and helps create design-driven projects that are supported by all these different aspects. I won't talk more about it, but I started this, got it running, we designed it, did everything. So it was a design branding project as much as an idea of an institution. And it would support things, or teach people how to use software and how to use these computers. And even this is a workshop of building nanomaterials, synthetic nacre. So out of clay you build nacre. Nacre is the material you have inside of oyster shells. And the cool thing, it's both, it's tough. So it's tough the way a car tire is, but it's hard the way glass is. So if glass is hard, but it breaks. Rubber tire doesn't break, but it's soft. But it has those both qualities. So that's what those guys built. So when you look at the digital from the point of view of that house project, what's really interesting is that you can rethink the entire paradigm of pre-manufactured, prefabricated, pre-cut housing. If you have a digital manufacturing system, which most wood building factories already are automated and digital, but they are doing buildings that look old. They look like they came from the industrial age. They are copies, and you can choose different. You can choose a cozy interior, you can choose a contemporary interior, you can choose some colors. But essentially what the digital, of course, makes possible is to make highly specific, aesthetically specific offerings to the market. All of you could have your own specific house. And then I, as the buyer, I could come to you and say, well, yeah, but what if I have 3 children and I have this sloped site? And you would say, well, I'll tweak my parametric model and it's no problem, and you'll get the plans in 2 hours, and then we'll manufacture it using the same details within the same concept. And that's of course possible. There's nothing preventing you from doing that. And it will, for example, change the way you have a conversation with the person buying the house. They can talk about their dreams. They'll approach you because they like the aesthetics of your house. If you hate this, you won't approach me. You like it, you'll say, you know what you're getting aesthetically, but then you can talk about the specifics. And the reason we built that one, we wanted to prove that you can do this at 2,000 euros a square meter, which is as low as you can go on basic housing construction. But what's really interesting, this is a community that we're involved in developing, is that if you use this method of working at larger scale, actually what you get is a community where the houses no longer are copies, nor are there these crazy expressions of individuality of me doing Georgian, you doing Victorian, but actually there becomes these nuanced variations of a whole. And it's funny enough, it's much more like a vernacular community, where there's a different sense of the relationship of the individual to the collective. There's a different kind of social space that this kind of community that's more materially coherent, formally subtly varied, it projects. And of course then you start, what we're working on now with this building is also like the software aspects of it, how software and existing hardware can produce services that help old people live in a house like this for a longer time, help young couples, help, for example, education or healthcare take place more in the context of the house. All of these things they're existing technology. We don't have to do anything. We just have to figure out how to contextualize them in this. Then when you think of manufacturing at the digital manufacturing at the scale of architecture, it's exciting to think about what 3D printing, for example, would do. This is something we did for the Estonian Architecture Triennale. And it's an old Soviet era post office, which we wanted to transform so that there's a new kind of dialogue between the new and the old. If that building is as hierarchical as possible, it's as symmetrical as possible, as symbolic as possible, we wanted to, of course, infect it with this virus that transforms it. And since it's 3D printing, why not include and bring media and graphics into the same frame with architecture and shift the place of architecture as a media? And there's a rendering on the left, and that's a 3D print on the right. And of course, this type of work, I put it there because you probably see the relevance of some of these explorations in the actual built work. If I show this to somebody who is not in the field, they'll just lose it, and they'll lose me. I'll lose them. They'll think, what on earth this has to do with anything? Is that possible? And so on. Of course, it's possible. But where I'm more interested in, retaining some degree of using still speculative work in order to push the envelope of what we're doing. So in terms of the digital, here's a simple example of an ongoing project. It's the idea, the way I would describe it for people is, hey, you can afford like world-class architecture that's very specific at normal cost. For the same price that you can get a box, we can do this. That's not quite true, but almost. So everybody in Finland has a sauna. Sauna is like a sculpture on your yard. That's the idea. You buy it, we can scale it. We have a parametric model where every shingle is linked to to the facets and the structure, and then you can vary the geometry, and all the pieces update. And of course, the biggest challenge is when you get this mess on the site. Like when you get these pieces, this is all easy, we can do it, you can do it, probably some of you. The problem is, how do you put those together? How do you not lose them on the building site? And that's where the cost can explode. So we practiced at the time all sorts of different methods of just like how do you number these and so on. And anybody who's had to put together a model for their project knows that that's involved. So what was interesting is that last year we had a really chance to test this. We built on the other side of the world, in Kazakhstan, in Central Asia, we built the Finnish World Expo Pavilion, which is always a great honor. Alvar Aalto famously built a pavilion in Paris. Eliel Saarinen did one. So in Finland, there's this great tradition of like architecture being invested in terms of this pavilion. So this was a big deal for us to get this. I have quite a few slides of this project because it involves a lot of things. It involves this issue of the digital, then the sensation, and then this idea of holistic design, because we curated the show, I even wrote every text in this thing. So you'll be able to feel value, everything's, we're to blame for everything in this project. But this is basically 5 buildings. They're about 8 meters tall. They weigh about 14,000 kilos each, give or take a little. They are made out of cross-laminated timber. No two pieces are alike. There's about 350 unique pieces. These were all pre-manufactured in Austria at Stora Enso factory. It's a Finnish company, but the fabrication is in Austria, packed up and shipped to Kazakhstan. And of course, this is what it looks like. You take the geometry, you do structural analysis, you do assembly drawings, you figure out how a large facet gets assembled from smaller ones, and all of this in a very, very tight budget in a country where we cannot control the assembly. We don't know the team that's assembling it. It's not like this has to work, and it's not like a building project also that can go late for a half year. So this is a high stakes game, a very public high stakes game. But I really wanted to see whether we could do it in this case. Can we do it in budget? Can we do it in time? And can we do it in a location, manage the quality? So this is what the construction looks like. There you see, you can't even tell each one of those big facets is made out of several pieces stacked up. And it's 10 centimeter cross-laminated timber. And then intersects with raised floor. I'll just skip through some of these. And then the whole thing was considered, the idea was a poché, in other words, building very thick walls every now and then, and placing the exhibits and the content inside the floor or inside the walls. So in the end, this is what it looked like, and this is what the idea was. The idea was to build 5 buildings that form an interstitial space, and then inside each building you have a totally different atmosphere and a different story to tell. And this is now where we get a little bit to the idea of sensation and storytelling, which is what we've had to deal with quite a lot recently. In other words, this project, and like many other projects, our client actually has an interest in telling a story. And I have actually, I think there's a log magazine I participated in, and I literally wrote that a story is an enemy of sensation. And I meant, by story, I meant the fact that if I can understand your design procedure, if I can read your concept, if the project becomes too legible, it kills any possibility for interpretation. It kills that escape velocity. But in this case, there's a story about Finland they want to tell, and clean technology in Finland. And the way we structured this, and the way we structure a lot of projects these days, is that one level is that of atmosphere. And on that level, we wanted to have literally Nordic lighting. So we used movie lights to simulate Nordic light, the same company that did Star Wars, Rogue One lights. We used, and those lights, the rent of those lights for 3 months cost more than all that material in wood. So we were serious about lighting. Actually, I have slides here that show you a little bit. Clips of different. And in north, if you know anything about the north, the light comes through atmosphere at very low angles and has a big difference between, you know, from one season to another. Then the idea was to somehow bring the atmosphere of Nordic society in this context. And what is that? We have things in Norway and Finland, we have things like the, and I don't know to my embarrassment whether this is true in Germany, but you have things like the every man's right. But imagine this is Kazakhstan, which essentially is a dictatorship. And they would have, there are 2 to 5 million, I forget, visitors who come. They are mostly Kazakh, Russian, Chinese. Right? So mostly authoritarian regimes. And our job is to then to promote the Nordic welfare state and that democratic model. So how do you do that? You're going to write on the wall that we're better? You're going to say, you know, like, I don't know, put a blonde girl and some reindeer and Santa Claus. What are you going to do? The idea was to actually create a feeling that would allow you to feel the way you feel in the north. In other words, a space that's more democratic in the sense that you're allowed to spend time in it. It feels atmospheric the same, but you're allowed to leave messages, you're allowed to hang out, and it's open for interpretation. So we seriously try to make people feel free in a different way. So when you pop into the pavilion, you would feel what that society feels like. And I'll show you concrete examples, but without saying anything. And that's actually the feedback we got, because they interviewed then a lot of people and what would they think and how did they react. And then each one of the pavilions on the inside tells a different story. There's a story about pure production of energy, smart cities, how do you get clean water, and how does education work in Finland. And in each one of these cases, the pavilion, the space, gives you a holistic view of all those things you need, for example, to get a good education. Because it's not just education, it's also free food. And the way teachers are educated and how they're treated and so on. This run through, you see, like glimpses into these different pavilions. So when you go in to the pavilions, then you have, because we design everything, of course, you have this wonderful opportunity of embedding things on the floor, in the architecture. And this might be so interesting, but if you want to do, if somebody wants, now if I meet a client, the first thing I tell them, I ask them, how is the project organized? Because what usually happens is that you meet the guy who makes the decisions, the woman who makes the decisions, they love your ideas, and they say, great, do it. And then you start doing it, but suddenly you realize that you're the architect, but then there's the shop designer, then there's the internet team, then there's the landscape architect, then there's, I know, somebody doing graphics, retail specialist. You have this big, wide level of people, and that's way too spread out for anybody to communicate. And you end up spending a lot of energy, and it becomes impossible to carry the idea creatively from one place to the other, to somehow figure out how does an exhibit that deals with wave energy get embedded inside the architecture, because the architect couldn't think about the exhibit because he didn't know it was there. So in all of these projects that you see, we try to put ourselves in a position where we do everything to a degree. We do, I didn't include it here, but we do entire signage systems, because you just feel different. You leave and you think like, oh, Finland is clean and it's wonderful, and you feel like I can do stuff, then like it feels right. You remember the feeling. But then you need somebody, how do you tell a story? There's a clean tech company that they want to tell you a story. How do you get anybody interested in that story? And that's the answer to that for us is art, the way art works. So what we do is we make these objects, I'll find one, that are This is not my best example, but that could be an example. It was in that role. Or this one here. You do something that evokes your curiosity. So you go in and say, what on earth is that? Oh my God, it's moss. They did an entire wall about moss. And then, once you get the people interested, then you provide opportunities for them to get deeper. You have, like we did, 360 touchscreens from which you can go in and then you can find out about the smart city or the company who did this. And then you actually people become active participants in building the story. And if you get clients like us who have vested interest in telling a certain story and all they know is putting an exhibit there or putting a big banner and expecting you to read it, that never works. And it turns out, funnily enough, that all of that work that we did in the arts, all of the experimental work we did in installations, all the speculative architectural projects actually gave us perfect weapons to design these environments that where we can, I don't want to say manipulate because it sounds so bad, but where we manipulate the feeling and then we can seduce you or provoke you or harass you into being interested in something. But all of that is to then you still have to do it. We're not telling you to do anything. There's a big difference in this. Yeah, there's a lot of it. So this is, for example, clean water. And it shows, we photographed my daughters drinking clean water from a tap, because in any of those countries, you're going to drink water from a tap. And that picture makes you think, well, how on earth can they drink water from a tap? And then everything around explains how do you keep the water clean, how do you manage sewage, and how do you optimally use water and recycle it. And that's the trigger. And you literally wrap all of this stuff in a space, and then this space has underwater sounds made by a sound artist. So, in other words, what we're trying to do here is use every possible register at our disposal and use the entire space at our disposal in order to, if you will, help you construct these stories. This has to do with education. So, it tells about free food, it tells about schools, and there's an interview of children. We interviewed 10 children who talked about the experience of Finnish school. And the cool thing was that we told the interviewers to leave all the bad stuff in, because that would tell us, make the point of free speech, that the kids can actually say what they want. And then there were things like an interactive game. This is a game that we built and designed with the software engineers that teaches people math in a new way through phenomenon and through games. And the phenomenon, of course, has to do with clean energy. But in other words, here are Kazakh children who play the game, and in playing it, they understand how teaching in Finland happens. And there's another bunch doing it elsewhere. So you learn through this activity. Then, this was a good example of how you do something that's politically critical. This is I'm getting out of architecture a little bit, I'll get back there, but this is a maternal care package. So when you get a child in Finland, every woman gets, and every family, man also gets a box which is big enough for the child to sleep in. It's very nice. And then it has all these things. It has even contraceptives. It has all of these things. And then all we did was we put it underground and said nothing. We just explained this is Finnish maternal care package. So what happens? Instead of us being critical of the existing conditions, they were fascinated by this. And you would get not just women and children, but men, and talking about it. What kind of country does this? I mean, where do you have this? And what happened was that Nazarbayev, who is the president, decided to come and visit, and he insisted that they show him the maternal care package. So who knows? If he decides, maybe all of Kazakhstan is going to get one sometime soon, because Finland actually delivers them as a service now. And you were able to leave messages. If you didn't like it, you could leave messages and participate and so on. So this is like a story of how do you use architecture, form, color, organization, but not only that, touch, sound, in order to communicate something in a very intentional way, but make yourself create all those sensations that then make you the active party in constructing or weaving to the actual story. And I have a little clip that shows you a little bit of the sound. This is 20 minutes of lighting condensed into a short animation. So that actually was, the sound was made was a digital mix of traditional Finnish singing and instruments, and then was this hybrid. And the form of that pavilion, because the entire history of Finland is that of a country between nature and technology, was there, all the forms and their aesthetics were staged in order to make affiliations to natural landscapes and abstract mathematics and the digital. So whether you like, whether, I don't know whether we succeeded, but that's, I forgot to take, the aesthetics are considered. That was the aesthetic response. Usually the Finnish Expo is a big modernist box with birch trees on it. So you put the nature and the technology in this sense. We try to hybridize both of those in the technology. So now I'm going too slow, so I'll go a little faster. I'll jump over some of these things. But now to these ecologies of objects. So there's several projects, last of which are 2 restaurants, in which, for one or the other reason, we didn't have the opportunity to actually do the building. So this is a Swedish-Finnish cultural center that has a hotel. And they need to do a renovation. And the question is, well, how do you as an architect do anything meaningful? And the answer becomes, for us, was in the form of objects. And we discovered that through creative misuse and creative use of digital manufacturing, digital design, and traditional craft techniques, you can actually quite efficiently produce bespoke design. And thus, instead of having to buy something from a store, a sofa from Capellini, and so on, for the same price, not all of these projects, the prerequisite was that the price of the object has to be the same or less than in a store of an industrial produced object. And there's a sequence of project where we produced increasing families of objects that then, where the whole project is about the relationship of the object to the other object and its environment. So they're really these architectural environments. And in order to understand, for example, the cultural center, I should show you a lot of images of what it's like, and the fact that there's brass and leather and black 70s material and so on. So the material palette comes from there, but then the forms are ours, and the manufacturing is digital. And in this way, we're able to actually have architectural scale effects by creatively using different digital techniques and actually making a good living out of these things. And the wonderful thing is, of course, you own all the rights to these things. We don't give the rights away, so we selectively allow people to buy them or manufacture them for other projects and so on. So we have this increasing portfolio of things. But just simply, that, for example, is 3D printed joints with straight brass elements, with brass pipes that are then welded, and a table. And I named it after my father, because my father used to work with Buckminster Fuller, who was into these geodesic domes. But this is, of course, asymmetrical and more biomorphic than any of those things. But there's that relationship. There's a light made with 3D printing and hand forging. CNC milled shoe and hand forging. I'll jump to the first things. Each room has a different 3D printed light, every one unique. So a similar technique, we used Finland's most valuable brand is Fazer. I don't know if you buy them here. They have actually the 2 most valuable brands, and they did a visitor center. And our job was to, what they called design the people's experience. In other words, we had to design everything, and I don't have a picture of everything, but the shop, the signage. But the most interesting thing in terms of this issue of sensational storytelling, as we convinced them that actual artworks are the best way for them to tell stories. So they make, for example, real eggs filled with chocolate. So we made a bunny with 10,000 eggs. And bunny is, of course, a symbol of fertility, so it's eggs. They're all white and round. There are all these things going on. But what happens is that there are guides, and the guides will, in a kind of peripatetic manner, take you through the center, and they will talk to you through the objects. So instead of there being one story that's repeated, there's actually a conversation, and it happens through these transitory objects. And there's a lot of fun because we haven't done so much until now. You've seen there's nothing that deals with representation, but suddenly we were modeling foxes. We thought that this is incredibly crazy. You know, large CNC mill sculptures that have to do with fluidity and chocolate and luxury. That's candy. This is a digital game with physical objects with RFID tags in there. This is a forum for having difficult conversations about sustainability and responsibility within the company. Again, this is where you leave messages. But that's actually, there were over 20 artworks that were designed just in order to allow them to tell these stories. But now to my most current and favorite part. There's a little bit an edited series of images of Finjevel, which is a restaurant, and then with these other guys, we just finished another restaurant, which is pretty wild. And we've been working with Johan on publishing this now here, but Finjevel means Finnish devil, and that's what the Swedes would call the Finns who would go to Sweden for, hope of better life, like a little bit rougher Finns who would fight and cause trouble, so they would call them Finn devils. For Finns, it means something like perseverance and guts and will show you and so on. And so the chef who was there, Henry Alén, he decided that he wants to look at Finnish cuisine and elevate it to the level of fine dining. So we're going to look at all the chefs everywhere in the world, more or less, are trained in, if they do fine dining, they're trained in French cuisine, even if they use local materials. So these guys wanted to look at those local techniques. And we said, well, the restaurant's in the context of mostly a historical protected building, and then there's a new part. Where's the opportunity for us to turn this into a cultural project? And we thought, well, let's take digital manufacturing, all Finnish manufacturers who don't understand the digital, let's work with them and let's try to design every single object in the restaurant. And let's see if the experience of the restaurant makes all of those objects so valuable to the consumer that they will buy them as memories and pay actual money for it instead of going to IKEA. Sorry, it's good that you're not Swedish, so I can all this. And it worked. Everybody said, this is never going to work. You're going to spend so much money doing this, it's never going to work. But it did work. We not only saw the object, the restaurant make the entire investment back in 1 year, and we designed, by the opening, we had designed 146 unique items for this. And we did this beginning to end in 8 months, the entire project. And this is a real restaurant that ran for 2 years, so the stuff had to work. So there's an open kitchen, and there's a little exhibit always of some of the selected objects made with a variety of techniques, digital techniques, married with physical techniques. But of course, in addition to this cultural project, or this almost a business idea, a new business model that was being explored here, the idea was about experience. How do you produce an experience which is appropriate for this restaurant? And how do you deal with an experience which takes place over 4 hours? There's one setting, it takes 4 hours for you to eat, and you get 15 different place settings. So our idea was to work with contrast. When you sit down, you never get the same table settings, and they radically change from transparent to white to rough to minimalist to expressively organic. And the spaces do the same. You go from one space to the other, and there's surprise and drama. So in other words, when you're designing a restaurant, you're actually designing a piece of theater where the audience behaves somewhat unpredictably, but where you have to work with everything else. And we brought in a composer to compose the music. We designed sculpture for the bathrooms. We brought in animals that you find in the menu. We designed the furniture that allows you to sit for 4 hours by changing position. That's super light, that doesn't destroy the floor. Design every single thing here. That's 3D printing and handmade accompanied for eating. This is the CNC milled molds with handmade clay and then flat. This is laser cutting cutlery, the CNC milled molds for glass and hand blown glass. All of different. That's a fiber optic lamp that works with a battery that's underneath there that brings perfect lighting for your stage setting, which is the table in this case. And it turned out as architectural thinking, which happens in time, and the kind of thinking that you had in the World Expo of one experience of the building, as it were, one dish after the other works in concert, as a sequence of sensations, rather than one thing, which when you come in, you perceive it, and it's over with, you've seen it. Here, and like in the World Expo, you have to go through the whole thing to see it all. And you'll be surprised, and there's quiet before the storm, there's surprise, and then of course all of this comes along with when people get involved and food comes. So this is, for example, a dish which is inside which you have smoke, literal smoke, and smoked fish. When you open it, the smoke comes outside, and then the smoke smell comes there in the air, and then they serve you the smoked fish. This is a cup, a plate with an ear, because in Finland there was a kind of what would you call it? A common habit, which was not, that fine people wouldn't do, which was, I don't know if this happens in Norway, where you would pour coffee on a plate, and then you would put a sugar cube in your mouth, and you do this. And my grandmother, who was a kind of socialite lady, she did this when I was a kid in the kitchen, always said, don't tell anybody, you don't tell anybody. So we made a dish together for the restaurant, where in a fine dining restaurant you have that plate but with an ear, and you're asked to actually do this. So there are a lot of these culturally specific things that are exotic to foreigners and hilarious to Finns. And the light with the glass makes changing artwork, and people play with it, becomes interactive, you can become participant, and it is all these processes and so on. Here are some images from the design process, just calling out some of the product, lights that are 3D printed. This is a funny one. This goes back to school, where at school you would keep your pencils. So in the end you would get this. This is CNC milled. You open it, and there's petit four, the little delicacies at the end of the dinner that you get from there. There's a little devil on everybody's table over a lamp that's given as a gift that you can take away. There are ceramics that look like our buildings, out of vitreous porcelain, on which the chefs would build landscapes. They literally build a landscape of a fox hunting a rabbit, and then there would be the kill, and that's where you would find the rabbit. This is, you see some of the glass that floats over wood, followed by a kind of raku, blood-fired thing, extreme contrast, cutlery, just laser cutting and hand forging, bones with the emblem of the restaurant. And of course, all of this makes sense finally when you get the food displayed on these things, and most importantly, the people and the service. And if you learn anything about the restaurant, the design doesn't in the end matter that much. What matters is the food, but even more than that, the service and the people do that. And unless those things are great, the experience is ruined. So there are limits to the power of design. But if, as with these guys, these things work, then you're in luck, and people will love your design even if it's not that great. So to finish, the last thing we just now did with these guys is Ultima, and it's in the same space. The previous restaurant was indebted for 2 years, and this project is about circular economy. And there's a lot of big stuff going on with this project, because there's big problems with food, and now the cultural project in this case If in the previous case was to elevate Finnish food to the level of high culture, in this case it's to look at the impending catastrophe in our food safety and food in general, and use a restaurant as a kind of atelier and laboratory for dealing with those issues and inviting the audience to participate in that. So the first question is, well, what kind of social space, what kind of mood do you want to create? And my hypothesis was that you want a good dream. You want to use surrealist techniques in order to lure people into a good dream. So they're willing to experiment, they're willing to entertain different ideas, they're willing to getting some of the information that they're being told. And this is how we did it. So there's a space that has world's largest indoor hydroponic in-restaurant system. There might be other ways, but in a restaurant, this is the biggest one. All produce is grown right in the restaurant, in the heart of the city. And the reason is to see if that could work. This can actually produce everything the restaurant uses, but it's also, and it eliminates trash, logistics, but it also gives you much better flavor. You get this incredible flavor. Then above in that space are these weird lamps floating. You sit in this green atmosphere, you are served dishes straight from the wall, but then you look up and there's something weird going on. And you know who likes lamps? Insects like lamps. So we built painstakingly with 3D printing, hand-blown glass, lamps that where the insects, the crickets that we eat, live. And these are, of course, there to cause a sort of shock and seduction in conversation, just like those things at the Fatser where there are story, conversation devices, or the embedded maternity care package. But more importantly, this is actually an instrument for experimenting how different ingredients affect the flavor of the insect. Because the crickets, if you feed them truffles, they actually taste much better than if you feed them chicken feed, which don't taste terrible. So in this case, there's an issue of bridging towards the audience and making them play, engage you in this wonderful mood, and then get them to experiment with eating crickets and help the chefs experiment with flavoring and cooking the crickets so that they become something that's more desirable. Then there are columns in this space, but we added some columns that are aeroponic. So the top part is a plant, that's a potato, and then the black part are the roots of the potato, and you spray water in the roots, and the roots are in air, aeroponic. It's air-based growing. And you can get 100 potatoes per set of roots. When in soil, at the most, you can get 30. And this uses a fragment of the amount of water and energy. So those are the actual plants that were poor plants. The plant will become 2 meters, and these become 1 meter in about 3 months. So they're just starting to grow there. So what we designed were these bio-design objects that somehow introduced things that were pushed into the periphery, the farm, outside of cities, and brought them right in the middle of the city, as if they were artwork, but they're actually instruments for the chefs to work with, and they are there to cause a conversation. So just like the stadium in the beginning, or the World Expo, or the Big Bunny for Fatser and so on, these things are not telling you anything. There's no instructions for use, they're not dictating, they're not forcing a story, but they will provoke or seduce a conversation. And they are functional. So this has coffee, this is a hand-blown glass ball with used coffee grains from a Finnish coffee shop, and then you inject it with mushroom spores, and you get 3 fruitings per ball until you have to change the grains. And they work as sculpture, but they actually, this is how those mushrooms are grown by a Finnish startup company. These are white oyster mushrooms, but you can grow all sorts of different mushrooms. These are the previous restaurant. You saw those dishes. Everybody asked us what happened with the dishes, the wonderful things, can we buy them? They're on the wall there. From the ashes of the old, there's a big bang and something new emerges. The company that we work with the lights just launched a new product. You should go check it out. It's called Voyager. It's actually an LED on which you can control the light and animate it any way you wish on your phone. And it's battery operated, so you can unlock it from this wall and carry it to a nightclub. It was a huge Kickstarter campaign, but we're the first ones to put it into architecture, and this actually reacts to your movement. So when you're in that garden of weird delights, then you go to the rabbit hole, like in Alice in Wonderland, and from the rabbit hole you come into this chamber of a Wunderkammer, essentially. And this is the historical building. This is a building where you cannot even put a hole in the wall. So the way to transform the space is with super light carbon fiber sculpture or chandelier with 3D printed pieces that cast shadows everywhere and move. And then the Wunderkammer is full of exhibits, which are these. These are imaginary insects. They are hybrids of plants and insects. My favorite one is, I told my kids, this is how it works. You take a pineapple, take a crab, you get a pineapple crab. You know that song? And these are, of course, this is how you tell, I figured out how to tell stories without having a problem with it. We put these things out there and people say, what on earth is that? And the whole idea of the restaurant is to make you question existing categories, make you question what things can be and what you can eat and what you can do. But this kind of ecology of objects, where the objects start to have conversations in your mind as you move through the space and as you move through time, actually turned out to be a really powerful way of doing it. And this is, everybody's wanting to buy this. I'm kind of horrified because I think I can see we could just stop everything and start making crazy insects. So there's the pineapple crab. The chefs put this on the internet and then people got to vote names for them. So that's a beetle with flowers. That's my favorite. And just to make sure that we go totally crazy, there's one sculpture that's missing. It's an 8-meter long sculpture of a bunny jumping through space in manufacturing at Finland's best shipyard. And this will be in the middle of this space. But then when you get to the actual restaurant, what we try to do, just like that weird 3D printed building, the appeal to reason, was to take one of the most precious historical interiors. We don't have so many in Helsinki, so bear with me. Like I have a lot of Italians in the office, they all go like, what are you guys? We have old stuff everywhere. In Finland you get something old, it's really watched after, let's put it this way. So what we try to do is to create a dialogue between the old and the new, and if the old was an architecture that articulated gravity, articulated how it was constructed, it was inevitably bound by its material constraints. We introduced the CNC milled architectural sculptures or elements which we floated. We laser scanned the space and we put them in these openings in the space and made them behave as if there was no gravity. And suddenly when you go to this space, you are in the dream. The architecture in the world no longer behaves the way you expect, and the movie lighting that we discussed, it's behind there, it's animated in a subtle way, but every psychological trick by now has been used in order to get you into questioning the way things are and get you to focus on the food that you get on the plate and that evening. And again, in this case, all the chairs are custom made, produced just for these restaurants and so on. So you can see how the flowers were not my idea, but the chefs came in and said, okay, it's a little bit too alien. And then they said, well, we have to get something, and let's get some orchids to feel people comfortable. And we discussed the flowers and orchids, that's okay. Apparently they all come from that. They're actually genetic copies, which somehow makes sense in the context of the restaurant. But you see that it's interesting to see what form does. I think, I forget who the original source was, but Sylvia Levin's book, Kissing Architecture, discussed the idea of experiencing form by projecting your body on it. And that's something, if you look at our designs, they are first and foremost staged to produce a kind of corporeal response and sensation as opposed to an intellectual one. And I don't want to mean that the two are unrelated. It's actually that response what then triggers your intellect, and you start making these stories and building your own narrative. And then, you know, that's how these projects hopefully, you know, get what Ian Bogos recently in a conference called escape velocity. Something that we put out in the world, but then they escape our control and become something else. And of course, again, these things are extended to every detail. You can carry the architectural scale to the scale of a napkin ring, to a miniature sculpture, to actually a serving object, glass serving object, a light. And here you have a really bad Instagram picture of crickets on hemp bread served on a 3D printed miniature sculpture. Same at the larger scale. Thank you. A bit long.
A few questions?
Well, now those famous questions. I knew I had quite a few slides. Thanks for surviving in the heat. Yes, please.
Regarding the Finnish pavilion with the light projection and sound, what defines the interrelation between space and sound in terms of design? In other words, what makes the space restrict the sound and vice versa? For instance, if we play any other music piece instead of Finnish traditional music, would it fit in the same space?
No, I mean, the sound was described as a digital sound sculpture. That was literally what we discussed with the sound artist. And the idea of the aesthetics of the architecture was to put it in a place where it's between the digital and the natural, because that we thought was appropriate, you know, for a representation of Finland, or the appropriate experience. And we wanted to do the same for the sound. So the sound was made entirely digitally from recordings of, let's say, vernacular material. And there was, for example, a woman who knew how to, this old call, when you call cows from the field to come back in, and that was recorded and then manipulated. And then the sound was choreographed so that each one of the buildings had a different sound. For example, the clean water building has underwater sounds, and it has acoustic conditions that are akin to being underwater. And of course, the education building had, you know, voices of children and so on mixed in there. So no, the idea of the light and the sound is that they're very subliminal, that you don't necessarily pay attention to them, but you would pay attention to the lack of them. And they direct the way you interpret the material that you see, and they color the architecture in every possible, literally and emotionally. So no, it was those were designed and were a crucial part of the experience. And that's, of course, always difficult to communicate in a PowerPoint presentation.
That's a great question, because obviously, so I know your Kivi has both extravagant and also explicit design. And so much of what you've done is very, very seductive. But I think that the question poses the following. So if I can translate the question, there are two strands to your work. One where there's a certain way it connects to certain things that went on in the 90s, and it's all about coherence and logic, you know, generated within a work, and it's not about necessarily so much representation of things. Yet, for instance, when we speak about your Guggenheim, we speak about a fluid form that sits next to the harbor, and you know, so we get the islands of Helsinki, and all that. And then you have the last project where you seem to go pretty wild.
And
Feels good.
And it feels good. And you have these. So we had Faber Kuppatan here a little while ago, and he also did a workshop where the term or word they used right now was hybrids. So this is your what were the different animals?
They were called hybrids, yeah.
They were called hybrids, but they are hybrids between fruits and vegetables and
Animals, yes. Insects.
And it's a completely different logic. And it's a completely different, and possibly also different kind of effect that's being produced. So I think that this question is, with all due respect, of course, to that project where you have clients and there's the belief that what is being produced or the way that Finland is presented must be means for representing Finnish values, as if there is a connection between a certain sound and whatever Finnish values might be. And then I think the question puts the finger on the fact that no, you could put in a different sound, and no, you wouldn't have to, that sound wouldn't necessarily have to sit with the client, and then it would produce a hybrid effect of something that is just very strange, but still very significant.
Oh, that's,
and so on.
yeah, sure. I mean, but that's interesting, like, it makes me think of Jeff Kipnis would always bring this example about, I think he was talking about just the way architecture works, but you taking the analogy from music and talking about what happens if I'm misquoting now, but the point is that if you take a comedy soundtrack and put it to a horror movie, there's an interesting hybrid. It does not produce the effect of horror, but it does produce something else. So you could, of course, do that, and the results might be more interesting. And there's a bigger conversation and that kind of struggle that you can see that when we are commissioned by a country in taxpayer money or the biggest brand in Finland to create work, and there's this age-old question, well, how is this not just bad advertising? And how are you critical in any way in any of these projects? And how do you in general relate to these issues? And I mean, this is our best attempt at doing that, but it's not entirely unproblematic. But I have to say at the same time, intelligent clients, for example, Fazer, they agree that there is no advertising. They agree that we have to bring in things that are critical and challenging into the center of the new visitor building. Because they understand that people, like their audience is intelligent enough to demand them, and they will do these things if you don't do them. But I don't know, I think the issue of representation, I think where I'm, how would I say it, there's this bigger theoretical, like couple years ago I was lecturing at the Angevante, and in that lecture the way they had structured the lecture, I would talk about, in terms of representation, I would talk about abstraction on one hand, and this is from Gilles Deleuze's book on Bacon, and then figuration on the other hand, and one figuration being something that looked like Jeff Koons' balloon puppy that looks like something, and abstraction is a Rothko or Malevich. And then this interesting place in between of where Bacon's work is, where it doesn't quite settle into any camp. And a lot of our work is in that place, is intentionally pushed to that place where it evokes interpretation, or I love people giving names to things, but I've been very uncomfortable with work using actual representation. But now with what I realized, that if you have an ecology of objects, if you have a sequence of objects, then the openness in terms of interpretation comes in the space between the objects. So if you build, a bunch of these insects and you put them out there, it no longer becomes representing one thing, but it actually becomes open in terms of interpretation in the way that I would desire, because of this space between the object. So, if that makes any sense.
I was actually going to ask you also about that. What do you mean by ecology? And you just said, so ecology of objects would mean in part relationships between objects.
Yes. Between the relationship between the objects and the relationship between objects and the environment. The environment being in this case architecture, but honestly, to go a little bit in history, when we started out, we did. I did, for example, in Helsinki cultural capital, built a giant steel structure. I mean, literally a ridiculously large abstract construction, and the idea was for that to be a kind of temporary museum that people would engage and people would take over, and it was made abstract so that it would come without instructions for use. And what I discovered was that a lot of people don't engage, that they will look at something and it just becomes off-putting or it's not seductive enough, and representation becomes a really powerful means of seducing people into the game. If you don't understand it, it also becomes, for other people, it's problematic. So if you put these little insects there in this landscape of other things that are harder to understand, it suddenly becomes this key through which they start engaging with the project. It becomes like a little handle into the world. So I think representation is a powerful technique of lowering this threshold and building a bridge to the audience. Sure.
Actually, this question stems from a certain kind of discomfort that I have after looking at this, because I am not able to see where these objects are kind of coming from. Is there a Finnish tradition of creating such kind of things, or you are purposely trying to cut out that kind of a reference line?
I have no idea. I always said when we commissioned to do a Finnish pavilion, I said, I'm Finnish, I grew up there, that's enough, it's Finnish enough, I'm not going to worry about it. I'm not going to brand it. So that's one explanation. The best, critical explanation was, there was a journalist, I was in his podcast, and he said, hey, your work looks like Alvar Aalto. No, so it looks like Salvador Dali went to Alvar Aalto's basement and then took some stuff there and did something to it. And I was very flattered. And it turns out that Herbert Musham, when he, one of the things that brought me to the States, wrote this article about our stadium that we did with Johan. He said it looked like Salvador Dali in collaboration with Fredericks of Hollywood that makes underwear. So Dali comes up, but there's a surrealist tradition in modern art, but I think other people have pointed that's relevant. I have always felt highly uncomfortable with any kind of nationalist tradition as an explanation to design. Design is global, and it's been since the modern era. Those guys, Aaltos, and they were all around the place. They were borrowing in conversation with everybody like we are. So, it has more to do with funding and taxpayer money and how funding is directed to promote Finnish design or Norwegian design or German design. But of course, in reality, those things don't really exist. I mean, there are, if I have to pick people, I pick Pietilä, I pick Aalto, I pick Virkkala, I pick Sarpaneva from design, and then those guys are from architecture. And there's a tradition of kind of organic, what they call organic, in other words, a little bit more expressive and free-form work, both in architecture and design, that has a relationship to what we do, but so does the work of Raymond Loewy or Charles and Ray Eames and a lot of other people outside of Finland.
Simply, could you tell us a bit about the trajectory of your office?
Yeah.
From the time let's say you could say that you established the practice and where it sits now?
Yeah, I mean, we are getting, honestly, it went a little bit like this. We did this speculation and installation work for, let's say, 10 years. And we did get some success, and then especially the ocean days, there was a lot of interest in in the digital, in the new model of practice, etc. Then there was this period of let's say, intellectually maturing, I suppose, in the really critical academic context and still pursuing the work. And now in the, it actually partially coincided with a lecture I gave, I think 2010 or 11 in Munich at the Architecture Museum here. And there was somebody who came from the audience who was a developer and said, I had just showed work that was just purely speculative and quite artistic, and he came and said, we've researched luxury. We've researched luxury with 2 million euros, and you're doing just what we want. And I said, what are you talking about? And it turned out that the fact that we had developed this skill with experience, it actually exactly what contemporary luxury was becoming. So to be blunt and kind of commercial, we get a lot of these clients that deal with experience. So the biggest brand or the country wants to communicate it, or the two best chefs in Finland, they approach us because they compete with experience. And then our job is just to make sure that the client is intelligent and we can do a project that we believe in. But that's the trajectory. We're getting these kinds of clients. And more practically, the next project we're doing after this is 3 buildings. We're doing 3 quite small but quite progressive buildings, also to shift way back into architecture. We wanted to do that. But again, for quite unusual clients that give us the opportunity of doing it. But that's I don't know if it's happening here. There's a interesting development with this thing called service design, where branding agencies are selling service designs, or people who work in the digital, and means that you look at a design as a service. So you just look at holistically every aspect of a person's experience. And of course, that's what we've done from the material side. But we've discovered that there's a lot of in a sense, people coming from fields like advertising and branding who it's okay when it's in the digital, but then they enter the physical world and they're selling themselves as service designers. So they will, in a sense, design the experience of the restaurant, for example, here, and then think somebody else will execute it, of course, which doesn't work. But nevertheless, there's an interesting trend towards looking at projects holistically. And if you look at the way most companies or offices are organized, they're in these silos, and it's very difficult for them to look at holistically. They cannot do a building that has a funny bunny and the bunny is on the graphics. It's very, and you cannot do these crossovers or carry an idea in an interesting way from a hybrid insect to, I don't know, a hydroponic system to a piece of architecture. Like, they cannot do that. And it's not because the people are somehow inept, they're very skilled, talented people. It's just the way the projects are organized like that. But there's this new interest, I think, at least in Scandinavia, commercially, on looking at, getting somebody to look at the entire project. And I think that's an opportunity for everybody in architecture, instead of just people from the branding side, to enter that space. And if you're equipped with these sort of digital weapons, you can do things that are really valuable for anybody who wants to produce a unique experience. That doesn't yet say anything about the quality of the experience, but anyway, like any shop, restaurant, hotel, museum, visitor center, all these people who compete, who remain in the physical space, they have to deliver experiences that you cannot download. I mean, that's my slogan. Like, we literally say, like, you need an experience you can't download. And you guys are the ones who are going to deliver them. And you have these incredible tools now with the digital to do them. And there's real added value to that. And you can actually run a practice and survive and be quite happy doing it and go a bit wild even.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.